Welcome back to Learning with Merit. Today we are going to look at the Linux file system with a GUI. In this video we are going to cover an intro to Linux, a file system review, we're going to look at a file manager called Nemo, we're going to look at the root directory and its subdirectories, also known as child directories, and then we're going to look at how to create, read, update, and delete files and directories in Linux. So a quick recap of what we just read is we have an OS is made of a kernel shell and a user interface. And Linux is a general term for a family of open source operating systems that was based on the Linux kernel, which was developed by this guy, Linus Torvalds, in 1991. Now we have sort of the package together, which is called GNU Linux, which takes a whole bunch of other software or large components of the GNU operating system and combines it with the Linux kernel. And this gives us what we think of as a complete operating system. We have the kernel and all of the other applications that make up the operating system when we put those together. For example, FSF, these guys right here, the Free Software Foundation, argue that they contributed many more of the components to the operating system than the Linux kernel did. For example, one of the major things that we will learn about in Linux is the use of the bash shell. This is how we will actually communicate with the kernel and give it commands. Now, Linux is typically packaged into what we call distributions, and these distributions are made of collections of software, and so you can think of it like we package the kernel, which is Linux, with the shell, which is bash, and then we develop a user interface, which is going to look a little different for every distribution because people have their different likes and dislikes, and that's why there's so many different distributions. And in addition to that different user interface, you will have different applications, and then even inside of that you will have lots of room for customization in this space here with the user interface and applications. And so that's a really cool thing about Linux. Another important thing we need to know about Linux is that the Linux, let's see, family, here we go, open source right there. So it is open source, and open source software, okay, is basically software where we can see the source code. We are given the rights to use, study, change, and distribute the software as we see fit. So the great thing about this is it's sort of user created. So the people who use this type of stuff also tend to be the type of people who are contributing to its development and things like that. And it's not everybody, but there are a lot of people who contribute to its development. And so not only is it good that we have that sort of development, it's also good that we have the ability with Linux to see exactly what goes into it. And it's like seeing under the hood. And then we have some very popular distributions of Linux. Probably the most popular, especially among beginners, is Ubuntu. There's also Mint. Mint is the distribution of Linux we are running in this particular video. We've got Debian, which a lot of different distributions are based on. We have Fedora, Manjaro, OpenSUSE, which is really hard for a lot of people to pronounce. Elementary OS, Pop OS, Zorin OS, Solus, Void Linux, Alpine Linux, and this is just the tip of the iceberg. Let's take a look at some other Linux distributions that are out there. So if we look at Linux distributions by popularity, we will see that there is Ubuntu, Fedora, Debian, Linux Mint, the one we're running, Arch Linux, which is fairly popular. The thing about Arch Linux is it's for people who want to build everything from the ground up. So a lot of these are packaged with everything sort of ready to go, but you lose a little bit of choice whenever you have everything packaged ready to go. And Arch Linux allows you to, every step of the way, pick the exact software that you want and literally build your distribution from the ground up. It's very interesting distribution of Linux. Requires you to know quite a bit of information to do it well. But anyway, these are all different distributions of Linux. Red Hat Enterprise Linux. Enterprise you can think of as this word meaning business. So anytime you see enterprise, think business or some sort of large corporation or something like that, right? And it doesn't have to be like a big corporation, but it does have to be some sort of business. And so some versions of Linux are run at the business level, and Red Hat Enterprise Linux, which you'll often hear or see as RHEL or RHEL. You'll see that a lot in Linux stuff, and you'll wonder where the heck does that come from? And that's what it is right there, is Red Hat Enterprise Linux. We also have interesting hacking distributions of Linux like Kali Linux. Kali Linux is a distro of Linux that comes bundled with all of the sort of tools you need to be an ethical hacker. And of course, you can put anything, any software, more or less, on any of these distributions that you want. Like if you really like Linux Mint, but you also want it to be able to do what Kali Linux does, you can do that. It's not impossible. It's you just have to go and download all of the right tools. But most people would rather just have all the tools come right together. So there are other distributions of Linux, quite a few of them. But these are the most popular distributions, at least according to a Google search result. And I would agree with this based on what I've seen people using and have heard about, that especially these top 9 or so are very popular distributions of Linux. So now that we've seen a little bit about the distros of Linux and the different things that you can do, let's actually take a look at maybe what they might look like. So if we come here and we look at Ubuntu desktop, see if we can get a good image of that. So you see Ubuntu might look something like this. And of course it depends on exactly what version you're dealing with. That's 14.04, so that's a little old. But it might look something like this with like a little taskbar over on the side, and of course it comes with its default background depending on the version that you have. But you still sort of have a desktop and a menu for applications and a taskbar. It's just maybe not in the same place that you're used to when it comes to things like here's another version. Let's go see what the current version of Ubuntu is. 2310. Let's grab that. And let's see if we can get a good image that way. Whoops. Let's try maybe this one over here. So anyway, we've got something that looks sort of like this, with your taskbar over on the left-hand side. Let's look at some of the others that there are. So Ubuntu was a big one. Of course, we're going to use Linux Mint, so you'll see that. Let's take a look at Fedora. See what Fedora Linux looks like. So you can see, at least on this one, let's go see if we can find the official information on it. Here's Fedora Linux. And let's see what we've got here. Looks like 39 is probably their closest one that we're going to get. Because that's their beta. So let's look at images here, and let's see if we can find what Fedora might look like. So you might have Fedora look like this. Again, we sort of have like a little taskbar. Now that's a little blurry image if we look at that. Some of these images are harder to find than others. Let's see what this looks like. So here's what Fedora Linux may look like. Of course, we have a little bit different. This is more like what a Mac might look like down at the bottom if you've used a Mac before. And of course, this is all customizable in all the different ways that you want to do it. Anyway, we'll stop there. But you can look up all of these little distributions and see sort of what they look like. And the truth is they're all really based on the same thing. Most of them will have the same shell, which is Bash, and they all have the same kernel, which is Linux. But after that, everything is different for the most part. Now, there's lots of things that are shared because, for example, like GNOME Desktop. GNOME Desktop is a very common desktop. There are also other ones like KDE Plasma, or other little desktop environments. XFCE is the terminal emulator that you may use. There's a lot of different applications that are shared, but for the most part, there is a lot of difference and variability in the different distributions and how they actually run. So if we get out of that and we get out of the terminal for just a second, here we have our Linux Mint distribution. Of course, I've zoomed in a little bit so you can see things, but we still basically have the same stuff. We have a taskbar down here at the bottom, sort of a system tray over here on the right. We have the start menu with a little Linux Mint tile instead of a Windows tile this time. We have a file manager application. This time it's not File Explorer, it's something called Nemo. We do have a browser here. This is Firefox, and of course we have a little terminal tool. And of course our start menu looks a little different, but for the most part it feels the same in a lot of ways to what Windows has felt like, especially if you've used Windows a lot. We have sort of the power, and we have the ability to log out here or lock the screen or do those sorts of things. A lot of our keyboard shortcuts are going to be different, are going to be changed, but you can usually go in and change those to whatever you want. We have system settings over here. We have, a software manager. You can think of this as like where we download and install software that we need to make sure that everything's up to date. Now, this is not the way most people will update their system, but if you've never really used anything other than the GUI, you may click on Software Manager and say, hey, okay, let's see if I need to update. And it will take it a second because, of course, it has to reach out and find all that information. We're not going to do that right now, but that's just something to look at. Of course, you have your browser and all kinds of different things over here. So let's review what a file system is. So we have a file that's a collection of data stored on a computer storage device, and they contain any type of data like text, images, videos, music, and programs. They are identified by their file name, which is unique and assigned to it when it's created. They're organized into folders, which are what we call directories that contain other files and folders. Then we have a file extension that is a suffix, meaning added to the end of the file name to indicate the file type. We separate it with a period. Our file system is a piece of the kernel, the Linux kernel in this case, that manages how the data is organized. And then for Linux, it uses, at least the most common use today, is the ext4 or fourth extended file system. Of course, there are some other file systems that we have talked a little bit about there. And then importantly, since we're no longer using File Explorer, we need a more generic term for what we are using, and it's called a file manager or file browser, and it's used as an application that provides a user interface to manage the files and folders. And of course, we could do it here from the command line if we wanted to. And in fact, let's go ahead and prove that we are actually using a ext4 file system. So I'm going to type a command here. Of course, you're free to look up what this command exactly does, but when we look at this, we hit enter, what you'll see is here is our file system of type ext4. And of course, our little backslash is what we call root. So ext4 is what we're looking at here. And we are, of course, on a Linux file system. So I'm going to go ahead and exit out of this and exit out of the little text editor here. And of course, here we have some files that I have created for this particular little endeavor. And of course, we have a tool that is open here. I'm going to go ahead and exit out of that tool, show you where to open it up at. Here we have, down here in Files, we have this little folder here. We can double click on it. Of course, it doesn't show its name, which is kind of interesting, but if you click on Help here and go to About, you can see that it is called Nemo. And this lets us actually organize our files and folders in much the same way that File Explorer does in Windows. So let me exit out of one of those. There we go. All right, so here we are greeted with something that is not unfamiliar to us, which is the desktop documents downloads, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And much like Windows, if you used Windows before and learned about that, we have a username folder. In this case, our user is student. And in the student folder, there is a desktop documents downloads and all of these. And of course, you pretty much know at this point, hopefully, what all of those folders are for. Of course, we will go over those in just a minute. But we also have all of this over here to take a look at. We have a home folder this time instead of something like this PC. If you click on this, you get your home folder, so where your user is at. And instead of having a big little, like we can click on the different drives and stuff, we have file system over here that we can click on, and this takes us to the root of the file system. So this file, or this folder right here, is the root. Now, before we go too much further in figuring out what all these folders are and what they do, let's talk about the settings for our Nemo file manager or file browser. We have file, edit, view, go, bookmarks, all of this stuff up here at the top. If we go to file, we have some different options here. We can change some properties. Of course, you can learn a few things about what permissions, emblems, which you can think of as like icons, for example, and we can change folder sharing if we need to there. If we look, we can close all of those, connect to server, open with, do all kinds of different things here, not dissimilar to what you may find in Windows. Then we have edit. We've got a lot of different options in edit here, including doing things like pinning, which we know about pinning. We can pin things to the taskbar or to like start, for example. We have select all, copy, paste, that sort of stuff. Copy to, which copies it to a specific location. View is going to be fairly useful to us. It's not unlike the View tab that we saw in Windows when we worked on Windows with that. We have different things we can look at here. We can change it to a tree, and we can see something that's a little different there. I personally kind of like tree, but we will reset it to its default there, back to places. And we've got a toolbar, so we can have, instead of a path bar, so this shows our path right here, and of course this little folder right here is root, right? But I like this view a little bit better. You can change it over here if you want. You can click on that. You can also go to view and change toolbar to location entry, and it'll look like this. And you can actually type out or copy a path to wherever you're at. So like if we go into, I don't know, let's click on some random folders here, you'll see that my path is showing up there, as opposed to this if I have that changed. So either way, I personally like the path, because the more you get into computing, it's a little easier to work with this than it is to work with this, but you can use it however. Of course, we have the menu bar, which is the thing up there at the top, right? It says you've chosen to hide the main menu. You might need to hit the Alt key to get that back. So we're going to hit the Alt key. We're going to go over here to the view and turn that menu bar back on. There's also the status bar, which is down here at the bottom. And we'll see that right there. Extra pane is so that we can have sort of like two locations that we're in and move stuff back and forth. This is something that wasn't quite as available in Windows. You could basically do the same thing, but it took a little more work. But you can move files and folders back here. So I could go like back to home and then back to student, and I can have something open in the root directory and also the student's home directory here. We've got toggle location entry, which is just this up here. We've got reset view to default, so we put everything back to what its default is. I'm going to go ahead and turn off extra pane. We come over here, we've got show hidden files. This is one we definitely need to do. We want to show hidden files and see all the extensions and everything like that. So we make sure that we show those hidden files. And you notice, hopefully you saw that, here we are in the home directory and a bunch of new files appeared. If I go back and I hide them, look at that. Big difference. So we definitely want to show all those hidden files because we want to be able to see what is going on. And people like to hide files that way as well. You can change show thumbnails, which tend to have to do more with pictures. And we come down here, there's also, whoops, we go to view, there's also arrange items. You can arrange them by size, type, all of these different things in a reverse order. There's zoom in, zoom out, change back to normal size. There's icon view, list view, so if you want to look at them by list, and I like this oftentimes too because it shows you plenty of things like what data type it is, whether it's like text file or what is, what exactly is it, when was it last changed, the size of the file. Let's see what else we've got. We've got compact view. We can look here. So if we look at this, we can see a different sort of organization for it, which allows you to see much more. You can sort of just pick the one that you like. A lot of people just leave it on the big icons like that. We also have Go, and there are a couple of things. Open Parent is interesting. So if I keep opening Parent, you see it keeps taking me up eventually till I get to the point of the root folder. So we know that a parent folder, which we'll talk about in just a second, is just a folder above or a folder that contains the current folder that we are in. We also have some other things that we can look at here. We've got a way to search for files. We've got home, computer, templates, trash. Trash is like the recycle bin from Windows. Home is going to take us back here to our home student directory. If we go to, if we go back to Go, we also have computer here, which is like this PC, for example, in Windows. And you'll see I am running a virtual machine, so you'll also see these two things here, but this is basically where our file system is. This is like the C drive in Windows. So if I double click on file system, whoops, did not mean to try to copy it. Double click, there we go. It takes me to the root of the file system. Okay, and you'll notice there's no drive letter in Linux. We don't have C's or D's or F's or G's or any of those. We don't have any drive letters. We just have our hard drive that contains our file system. So anyway, of course, trash is anything that you've deleted. You can use, that's your recycle bin. And then, of course, anything that is on the network. Bookmarks are going to be quick locations that you want to go to. So you can add a bookmark, for example, and then you'll see them down over here. And then we have, let's see, it didn't like that I tried to bookmark the trash. But anyway, you can edit bookmarks. So let's say, hey, you've got that one right there and its location is trash. We can just go ahead and remove that and hit close. And then the last thing is we have help. And if you need to know the keyboard shortcuts, this is super useful. They do a great job of showing you all of the little keyboard shortcuts. And of course, you need to scroll down just a little bit. I've got mine zoomed in a little too much. But the idea is here's all the different things that you can currently do to do different stuff with just the keyboard. And then last, if you want to see about, for example, you can see that this is Nemo. This is the version of Nemo. You could look at its use license if you wanted to. But Nemo is an application that is a part of our operating system that allows us to manage these files and folders. So directories are folders that contain other directories and files. We have parent directories or superdirectories that contain other folders. And then we have child directories or subdirectories that are contained within other folders. Okay, we have a file path that indicates where we are in the system or where a file is in the system. And then in these file paths, we have a directory structure. So we show the folders separated by forward slashes, and then we have a file name. In Linux, like in Windows, we have absolute and relative file paths. Absolute meaning starting from root, and relative meaning starting from your current directory. There are some examples of absolute file paths right there, where we start at root and go to where we're at. And then we have relative file paths that assume where you are currently at and then use things like dot and dot dot, for example. And dot represents the current working directory, and dot dot represents the parent or super directory, so the one right above us. And then when we're working with Linux file paths, we use forward slashes instead of backslashes like we did in Windows. And then we use periods, either 1 or 2 periods, to indicate where we want to be, either in the current or in the parent directory. Now let's actually take a good look at the folder structure here. So if we come here and we look at home and we go to file system, this brings us to the root directory, and I'm actually going to change the view here. So if we change the view to, let's see, where was I going to do this? No, oh, there it is. It's hidden. That's what I was looking for. Compact view. So here we have all of the different little folders that we have inside of Linux. And you'll notice, if you remember from Windows, this is a lot different than what Windows had inside of it. So let's take a look at the different files and folders that we have inside of this little directory here. So they contain most Linux distributions contain most, if not all, of these directories. And of course, root is represented by a single forward slash, and it contains every other directory on the system. And here we have a brief explanation of each of the major folders or major directories that you find inside of the root directory. So with that little explanation of what we have here, we can see each of these different folders have very specific use cases. And of course, we also have our user home directory that contains things like our desktop documents, downloads, and other things like that. So very interesting. Let's go and find our home directory. So here is home, and this is different than on Windows. In Windows, you would have a users directory that contains all of the user folders, but in Linux it is home. So you want to go to home, and there's only one user on this system called student. I'm going to double click here on student, and this is where we are going to work next. Now finally, we need to do a little bit of CRUD. And CRUD is just so funny because it stands for create, read, update, and delete. And let's do this. Let's go ahead and do this in our documents folder. Now we can do it in any folder that we want. Heck, we can even change the view to compact view if we want. And look around here. We've got a lot of different files and folders here. And in fact, for some of you more interested viewers, I suggest you look at what the bash rc file does and what you can do to it, because there's some cool stuff you can do there. Be careful though, you can really mess up some things if you don't pay attention to what you're doing. Now let's go to documents here, and we have a sort of a blank slate to work with in documents, and we are going to create a few different things. First, let's create a new folder. Creating a new folder is very easy. I'm just going to right click here and create a new folder. I can also click on help and look at keyboard shortcuts. Let's see if there is one for creating a new folder. May have to make everything just a bit smaller here to find it. Don't see one just offhand, but maybe you can find one. I'm going to create a new folder here by right-clicking and creating a new folder. And of course, it creates us a new directory that we can work with here. I can right-click on it. I can do some of the same things that we did in Windows. Whenever we looked at Windows, I can move it to the trash. I can do all kinds of stuff. We have a new little tool lets us open it in a terminal or use open as root. Root is our administrator. Okay, so Windows has an admin and Linux has root. So keep those two things straight. That'll help you. We of course can rename this folder to my folder if I want. Now that I have a folder, I can go into that folder. Can right click again. You might see, well, how do I create a new file? Well, we go to new document and empty document. Now the crazy thing about this is that whenever you rename it, the file extensions are not actually required in Linux. Basically, it treats almost everything as a text file unless you give it an extension, but you don't have to give it an extension. Extensions are more for ease of use. So in this case, I will call it file.txt so I understand what it is for. And I think that I accidentally added a little piece there. Let's try that. There we go. So now I have file.txt, and if I double click on it, it understands that it's a text file and will open it as a text file, and I can come in here and edit it. Now this is not Notepad. This is actually a tool called XED or XED if you want. And of course you can get all kinds of different text editor tools and things like that that you use. You don't have to just use the default, but that is the default here. So now we know how to make a folder. We know how to make a file. I can delete my file. Okay. By right-clicking and going to delete. I can also move it to the trash. All right, and here's the thing. There's a difference between delete and delete in Windows, for example. Move to trash is like move it to the recycle bin like we do in Windows. Delete is actually delete it, so don't send it to the recycle bin. So that's a good thing to keep in mind. It doesn't have that protection that Windows does for you deleting something and not knowing what you're doing. So it's not a bad idea to move things to trash as opposed to delete them until you're certain you're never going to use them again. We also have compress, which is kind of interesting. What is compress for? Oh, look at that. .tar.gz. Oh, this is an .zip. This looks like a way for us to make archive files. That's pretty interesting. We'll have to take a look at that later. And then we have, of course, cut, copy, all of those sorts of things. So if we need to delete it, we'll just go ahead and move to trash. We will go back one and move this one to the trash. Delete that as, whoops, see, this one, it will be permanently lost. I didn't move it to trash, it said delete this time. So it is permanently gone whenever I do that. Last thing we're going to do is I'm going to make a new file here, and I'm going to show you how to copy it. It's pretty simple. We'll create a new document, empty document. We'll call this toCopy. You notice I didn't add a file extension that time. It's not required, but it is helpful. So I'm going to rename it in .txt. And then we can right click and copy. You can Control C and copy and Control V and paste, just like you do in Windows for that. So that's pretty simple. Of course, we can highlight those. You can Control X to cut, and then you'll see if I try to paste it, it wants to overwrite those, and I'll just click replace, and it'll replace those two files. Or I can cut them this way, and I can go, let's say I want to go to the desktop, paste them there. You'll see there it is in the desktop now, and it's no longer in documents. And now I'm going to delete both of these again. Hit delete. Yes, they're going to be permanently lost. That's fine. Remember, you should put it in trash if you want it to be possibly recycled for you. And I think that is all we basically need. It's very simple. It's very similar to Windows in what we're doing here. Of course, that's why I picked Linux Mint. It is similar to Windows in quite a few ways and should make you feel pretty comfortable as you dive into Linux. With that, thank you for watching Learning with Merit.